We know that the Greek and Roman empires were some of the most advanced and influential civilizations in history. But what was life actually like for people in these societies? Of course, it depended entirely on a person's status, social standing, and background. There were plenty of similarities between the lives of people in both societies. There were also some significant differences, although on the whole, both had a lot in common. First, the facts. The Greek Empire is generally considered to have lasted from around 800 BC to 146 AD, when it was defeated by the Romans. The Roman Empire started at a similar time and ran to the 5th century AD, when the Western Roman Empire fell. At its peak, the Greek Empire had up to 10 million, while estimates of those under Roman rule were as high as 70 million. Both societies had massive influences on the rest of the world, many of which are still prevalent today. The Greeks made groundbreaking discoveries in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and mechanics. The Roman Empire brought us aqueducts, roads, concrete buildings, and medical tools, to name a few. Both civilizations introduced democratic forms of government that have been the foundations of political systems around the world ever since. So, how did people live in these empires? What were the differences in standards of living and quality of life? In both Greece and Rome, the family unit was the foundation of society. Regardless of wealth or social status, the family was regarded as the most important unit. And just as elsewhere in society, the male was the head, wielding ultimate power. In Rome, the father could disown his children if he doubted their legitimacy or if they were deformed. He could sell his daughters into slavery if he so wished, and decided who they should or shouldn't marry. This was very similar to Greece. Men had the final say in all matters concerning their families. If a man wished to divorce his wife, all he had to do was return her to her family and pay back the dowry. In Greek society, men ran pretty much everything. Women weren't permitted to participate in politics, and most weren't even allowed to mingle in public. Their primary role was to look after the household and to bear children. If they had slaves, they would send them out to do the shopping, and they would supervise the slaves with the daily chores. Roman women were afforded significantly more freedom, although they were largely expected to maintain the household. Roman women could go to the baths, theater, and games. In later years of the empire, they also worked, often as bakers, pharmacists, hairdressers, and shopkeepers. Still, both the Greek and the Roman empires had very similarly structured societies. At the top were the wealthy citizens, the aristocrats. They owned land, businesses, and slaves, and lived in the most protected parts of the cities. The upper-class Greeks and Romans basically acquired their wealth from the spoils of agriculture. They owned land and put slaves to work, farming crop and attending to livestock. Next were the common citizens, some of whom were extremely poor and struggled to make a living. Many men in both Rome and Greece worked in a variety of trades, such as bakers, carpenters, and fishermen. Others plowed the land or they rented space from wealthy landowners. Children in Greece and Rome were usually taught their basic education at home. This was often the mother's task, or if they could afford it, a slave would tutor the children. Basic subjects included writing, reading, and math. Children from a wealthy family might continue their education at a private school where they would learn philosophy and music. And still, another class in these societies was the non-citizen free person. They didn't have any official citizenship, but they were permitted to work and enjoy many of the benefits of citizens. These included access to public baths and various forms of entertainment that both empires were very famous for. Many of these non-citizens were former slaves who had been granted their freedom. Thus, below all these classes were the slaves. As you would imagine, their lives were a fairly miserable affair, with their only hope being to win over their master and gain freedom. Slaves were an everyday part of life in ancient Greece. They were usually captured in war or purchased and performed every menial task imaginable. Many worked on farms and in all important agricultural industry. Others had slightly cushier jobs doing domestic chores for families. While not every Greek citizen had their own slave ownership was certainly high. Some estimates put the number of slaves as a percentage of the total population as high as 30%. This was also very much the case in ancient Rome. Slaves were purchased at slave markets and then set to work performing any number of jobs. Some toiled in the fields or did domestic chores. If a slave had an education, then they would often tutor Roman children. Just as in Greece, slaves in ancient Rome had no rights. They could be sold, punished, or even killed by their masters. Freedom could only be gained if a master granted it. In Rome, if you were one of the lucky slaves and were actually paid for your efforts, you might be able to save up enough money to buy your freedom. The status of people in Greece and Rome was reflected in where they lived. The wealthy citizens naturally lived in the bigger houses near the city centers. In Roman cities, many of the elite lived in spacious ground floor houses because these had access to fresh water being piped in. These houses were often made of cement, which was not only sturdy but helped to insulate in summer and winter. The poorer classes had no such luck and were confined to tiny lodgings that were not only cramped but had no water. These often overcrowded apartments were stinking hot in summer and bitterly cold in the winter. In Greece, houses were typically constructed of mud brick or wood. They lacked the innovation of cement that was used in wealthier Roman houses, and the downside of this was that they had to be rebuilt whenever they were washed away or melted down. However, despite the class of the person in both societies, most were allowed to indulge in the ample recreational activities on show. Wealthier Romans had particularly good lives. A typical working day might start early in the morning and then wind down in the early afternoon. This left them free to either head to one of the many baths available or to attend one of the games. The games included chariot races, wrestling, and the massively popular gladiator battles. The Romans loved their baths, and for good reason. A typical bath would have a pool, sauna, cooling room, relaxation room, and a gym. Most modern health clubs and gyms still use that model. People would meet there to socialize or to discuss business. Any Roman emperor worth his salt would make sure that there were plenty of baths for the masses. Women were permitted to go to baths, just not at the same time as men. The games and the baths are available to both the affluent and the poor citizens, as the Romans believed that everybody deserves some good old R&R. Ancient Greeks also loved their downtime. Men would go to the gymnasiums where they could practice sports like wrestling, boxing, and javelin throwing. The agora, or marketplace, offered other avenues of entertainment. For men, that is. These were massive spaces the size of 2 football fields. At the agora, there were drinking bars, barber shops, massage salons, and the all-important baths. Just as in Rome, baths played a crucial role in bringing people together to wash away their worries or to talk shop. The ancient Greek and Roman Empire's economies were also largely based on agriculture. Fishing and sea trade was also an important industry in Greece, as it offered alternative food sources for its people. Roman farmers discovered that rotating their crops every year kept that soil fertile. For example, they might plant wheat one year and then beans and peas the next. But not everybody had access to all this food. In fact, many Greeks and Romans suffered from malnutrition. Bread was a staple for everybody. It was easy to produce and easy to keep. In Rome, breakfast would often be some bread with honey or fruit. Lunch might be some more bread with cheese, eggs, or salad. And if you were one of the wealthier citizens, you could maybe even enjoy some meat for dinner. Pork, chicken, lamb, and fish were all there if you had the money. All of this was washed down with wine, often mixed with water. The poor couldn't afford meat, and they relied on bread with fruit or olives to get them through the day. Greece was very similar. They ate bread daily, supplemented with fruit, beans, milk, and cheese. The soil near the ocean was difficult to cultivate, so these areas relied more on fishing for their staple diets. Surprisingly, there were no potatoes in ancient Greece or Rome. These were introduced to Europe by Spanish explorers who had discovered them in South America. As you can see, the daily lives of the ancient Greeks and Romans were very heavily structured. People ate, worked, relaxed, and then went to bed and did it all over again. Many of the facets of everyday life in Greece and Rome can be seen in our daily routines. The grind of work, the need to unwind, the importance of the family as a unit. These civilizations were by no means perfect, but what they achieved and what they contributed to future societies is nothing short of amazing.